before I go into this a little bit about the weekend, let me firstly welcome Tim, Major General retired Tim, although you still look very fit to me, I might say. Major General Tim Cross. And Tim, we'll give you a proper assessment of your performance on Sunday, the last one. But we're really looking forward to having you, and thank you so much for your commitment and time in being with us for the whole weekend. And I met Tim a little while ago, and subsequently a number of times. And each time that I've met him and met him with Stephen and Dave before, I always leave feeling, it's been time well spent. And that's a credit to your experience, your knowledge, but also your heart for sharing what you like doing, Tim. So thank you for being with us. And you guys will learn a bit more about Tim as we go through the evening and certainly through the weekend. So why are we here? Why are we here? We've got a very simple philosophy amongst our men's group in our house church that Dave and his lovely wife Karen lead, and that's all about bringing guys together who, in a time in the world where so much is changing, there's so much uncertainty, and our passion is to help men just become comfortable in themselves, be authentic, be happy to share tough times with other guys. And you guys remember I sent out that video clip that Simon Sinek was speaking about times during COVID. And who's the guy you're going to phone when you're struggling that you can actually cry on his shoulder? And us men, we get a bit confused, because we just want to have this bravado, and sometimes we need to learn from the women about how they share their inner feelings. And our belief is that by building friendships, building trust, we can open up opportunities for men just to be comfortable in their own skin and be happy to share the things that are sometimes a struggle. Well done, Andrew. You did a very good time. Sorry, we've just started, Andrew, but good to have you here. So, really the purpose of this is about building friendships, building relationships and getting top-class guys like Tim, like Andrew Finley and Adam Swiss last year, just talking about the things that have really got them going in their lives at different stages. And there will be definitely a Christian spin to it, but honestly, this is about bringing guys with you. Have a faith, whether you go to church regularly or you don't, to get an environment where you can have fun, you can relax. We try and not over-structure these things, so there's plenty of time to have freedom, to walk in this beautiful environment, to swim, to kayak, or just to chill in the garden or play games. And Graham, thank you for all the games that you've brought. You're going to keep the boys quite busy, it seems. Rugby balls and all that. Last time you played rugby, you pulled a hamstring from them. So that's really what the men's group is about. And our theme for the year is about making a difference. And that links very nicely to the theme of this weekend, which Tim will talk about a bit later, around how can we, each one of us individually, make a difference to others around ourselves. It's very easy to become self-focused. There's lots of change in the world, uncertainty, but how can we try and reorientate ourselves away from ourselves to other people and have an eye out for other guys who might be struggling, that we can put our arm around and actually help them work through times that often are much difficult than things we think are quite difficult that we are grappling with. So making a difference is a theme for the year, and our challenge to one another is how can each one of us in our right, and we sometimes discount ourselves because we think we're not good enough, or maybe the guys who are better at doing things than I am, that you just say, well, let them do it. And our objective is every one of us to stand up, get a grip, and make a difference, because we can. Andrew Wilton's a great example. John Wardrope, one of the elderly guys in our church, he goes and spends time with him, and that's all John wants. He just wants people spending time with him, And Andrew probably would have discounted himself from standing up and running a men's event or something, but he makes a difference to John's life, Andrew. And thank you for doing that. It's a great example of each one of us, how we can do different things. So the weekend we'll talk about shortly, but I think the most important thing, there are a few timings that are quite important. And because we're a bunch of a number of guys, it's quite important for some of the times to be respected, if you don't mind. So breakfasts are at 8:30. Okay, now that might sound early for some of you, but the purpose of that is also to give you freedom in the rest of the day. Yeah, breakfasts are at 8:30. Tomorrow, our resident chef, Mark Stevenson, although I believe you've got a better chef alongside you who cooks a variety far greater.
I'm sous chef.
Yes, exactly. Craig, thank you for also being in the kitchen with Mike. But yeah, I can tell you that the food is going to be amazing because we've got some very good chefs on site. But if you guys can be ready to eat at 8:30, and when we finished eating, there'll be a few talks. Dave will speak a little bit about a thing around that he's got in his heart, and then Tim will do his first chat on morally courageous leadership, which we'll talk a bit later about. And then the rest of the day is free until 5 o'clock, okay? So 8:30 and 5 p.m. Those are your two times you need to remember for tomorrow. And 5 p.m. we'll again meet back here. Tim will do another chat. We'll have a braai, not a barbecue, because the English oaks aren't allowed to get near that fire. The South Africans have been appointed by our head chef, Mike, to do the braai. And then we're going to have an open mic evening, and we expect everyone to participate, be it with an instrument, be it in singing along with the guys. We've got a top-class musicians with us here for the weekend. Sunday, 8:30 again, we'll do a talk. And you guys will leave after that. It's going to be a very simple breakfast on Sunday, just sort of the healthy stuff that normally chases Mike Stevenson a mile away. But he'll do the fry tomorrow to make up for it. And I would expect you'll get away around about 11 o'clock if you want to. If you want to spend the rest of the day here, all we ask, please be out your rooms by 10 a.m. on Sunday, just to allow the guys, if they want to clean. Quite frankly, the caretaker's not here the weekend. I don't think it's a problem, but it's easy enough to take our kit out the rooms, and then you can spend as much time as you want to for the rest of the day. So that's a little bit about the weekend. Tim will talk about his bit for the weekend. And then I'm really excited about our next sort of major large-scale event in October. We've got a fantastic guy, Paul Cowley, who Tim has introduced us to. Paul has a very interesting life around growing up in a very difficult home situation. He calls it in his book a dysfunctional home. Both his parents were alcoholics. His father was a sort of physical abuse of the family. Left home at the age of 16 because he couldn't get on with his parents any longer. From memory, he might have been thrown out of the home, landed up with a difficult, on the streets, and it's called thief, prisoner, soldier, priest, because he had to fend for himself, got involved in gangs, started doing some sort of petty theft and that type of thing, got locked up, and then decided to join the army. And I'm not quite sure, Tim, exactly when you met Paul, you'll tell us shortly. And then he had an amazing experience. In fact, his mother, as he got older, he grew closer back to his parents again, died in his arms, and she gave him her Bible. And that was a turning point in his life when he then became a priest. He's now very involved in Holy Trinity Brompton. Many of you guys will know is one of the very large and successful churches in the UK, and he's doing lots of work now in working in prisons and helping give guys who come out of prison a new hope, a second start in life. Yeah, and he's actually employed by Iceland Foods. You guys will know that frozen food retailer, and it's all about going into prisons, identifying guys who have the potential to get into a job quickly in Iceland in order to get back into the normal world again. And they say that one of the most difficult things when you come out of prison is there's no one that you know in the world because you're only used to being with criminals. Yeah. So massive work. And so Paul's talking on the 14th of October in the Tithings in Yateley. It's going to be a big community event. We're aiming to have at least 50 guys around to that. And the whole objective there is to give people hope. Give people who are struggling in life the hope of there's a better way to your life going forward by actually overcoming some of these difficulties you've had, these addictions, what they might be, and making a difference to other people around you. So that's a fantastically exciting thing. I'd love all of you guys to come along to that, but not just you guys come, to bring a friend along as well, particularly someone who you think that might be relevant for. Yeah. So that's our upcoming event in October. We've got other things like snooker that Dave Folkley organises every now and again, which is great fun. And the whole idea is to create environments, opportunities where guys can get together and get to know one another and enjoy spending time together. So that's a bit about the men's ministry, what we aim to do, and a context for this weekend. And maybe I should ask you and introduce you, Tim, and you better able to introduce yourself. So I've got a few little questions I'd love you to answer as a means of just introducing yourself to the guys so they know who this oak is that they see around us this weekend and what he has on his heart. But I think the first question, Tim, I'd have to you is, tell us a little bit about your early life and how you came to join the army.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dave, and thanks for inviting me. And I should start off by saying I love working with blokes. Most of my military career, which I'll touch on, the vast majority of it was with men. And one's got to be a bit careful about what one says nowadays in all of this, but I just love being around blokes. I think men need men to rub up against, to be challenged by, and to spend time with. And I think a lot of men today find themselves quite lonely, frankly. So I think this sort of stuff is, really, really good. I was born in 1951. My mother was a nursery nurse during the war, and I was illegitimate child. I would have been called a bastard in those days. She had me in London, although she lived in Coventry, so she was sent away to have me. I never knew who my real father was. And she loved being with small children. And she met the guy who I always know as my father and knew as my father. He had 2 boys. His wife had been killed just after the war. His 2 sons had been born in 1946 and 1947 in Trinidad. He worked for Shell. And my mum worked for him, basically as looking after the boys as well as me. And he was then posted to Australia. And I think it was a sort of business arrangement, really. I think he said to my mum, I'm posted to Australia. I need somebody to look after the boys. Do you fancy getting married and coming with me? So they did. And they subsequently had my younger brother. So I was adopted in 1952. We went to Australia in 1952. Came back in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. And then Dad was posted to Manchester. We lived in Westcliff, one or 2 other places. And then he retired to Somerset in 1962. I passed my GCSE, no, not GCSE, my 11 plus, as we called it in those days, on 11 plus, and went to a grammar school in Somerset. I was lousy academically. I left school with 2 O-levels, for those of you who remember what O-levels were, the precursors to GCSE, 1 in geography and 1 in English literature. And I went to Bristol to sign up as a soldier in the Somerset and Cornwall Light Infantry. I joined the cadets. I'd been a scout. I loved all this outdoor stuff. I didn't want to work in an office. I was not good academically, so there was no way I was going to carve a career out in business. So I went to the recruiting office in Bristol. I still remember the guy. He was a gunner. His name was Captain King. He chatted to me, interviewed me, and cut a long story short, somehow I ended up in an Army 6th form college studying maths, physics, and science, having failed them all miserably at O-level. So I did a couple of years at this college, so I went in Nottingham, up near Nottingham, finished there, left with 3 A-levels at the lowest possible grade you could secure, grade E, just scraped through them all, and then went to Sandhurst in 1969 and was commissioned in 1971 from the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, of course, just down the road from Yateley. 2-year course in those days. And I was saying earlier on to a couple of guys, I've just had a week in the Brecon Beacons in Wales. And whilst I was there, I went and had lunch with my old drill sergeant from Sandhurst days, 51 years ago. Brian Abyard, Welsh Guards, great guy. And So I was commissioned in 71, and I did 43 years. We'll touch on that in a moment. I've never understood why anybody, any man between the ages of, say, 16, 17 to about 25 wants to do anything else other than be in the army. It is fantastic. I loved every day of it. It sounds pathetic, really, doesn't it? But I loved every day of it. And I left 43 years later, having served man and boy.
Good man. So I've heard some talk earlier today, Tim, that the Navy guys are much better than the Army guys, and they're much better, sort of more
Senior service.
force. But perhaps we'll leave that over a beer a bit later. So you're in the Army for 43 years. Tell us about some of the highs and some of the lows that you went through in the Army.
Yeah, I should say my eldest son was Navy. He was a nuclear submariner. We are weapons engineer. So yeah, commissioned in 71, and so in a way there was sort of a series of decades that followed. 70s dominated by Northern Ireland, and I served in Northern Ireland doing bomb disposal work as an ammunition technical officer for a year, and I served in Germany during the Cold War. There's quite a few older chaps around the room, not quite my age, but many of you will remember the Cold War years. Germany was divided between West and East Germany. Berlin was a divided city with 4 military governors who had the power to hang people. And the Cold War, we had on the opposite side of the Indo-German border, we had 3 shock army, a Russian army that we believed in those days would have done, quite serious business. I mean, when we watch them in Ukraine now, we may have a different view, but it was serious stuff. And I did 4 tours in Germany altogether, and 3 of them were during the 1980s. So that period of Northern Ireland and the Cold War, that's the 1970s. The 1980s was dominated really for me by Germany, with other tours in Germany. I wasn't involved in the Falklands campaign, but I did a lot of tours within the UK in various different places. And Staff College as a student, and then as a member of the directing staff at Camberley. The Army Staff College was in Camberley in those days, so I did a couple of tours there, and then went back to Germany. I commanded in Germany as a company commander, and then went back to become the commanding officer of the same battalion that I'd been a company commander in. In fact, I'd been the adjutant of the same battalion back in 1979. So I did 3 tours with the same battalion. Took over command in the late 1980s, having been at Staff College, just as the Cold War came to an end. So as an instructor at Staff College, we were beginning to think, what are we going to do now? Genuinely, we thought, the Cold War's come to an end, what are we going to be getting up to? And there were big defence cuts at the time. I left the Staff College, took over command of the battalion in September 1989, and of course at that moment Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, for those of you who remember. So the first year of the 1990-1991 was part of 1st Armoured Division in Kuwait, kicking Saddam out of Kuwait. Decision made not to go on, to get rid of Saddam Hussein. We'll touch on some aspects of this during the weekend, but one of my mantras in life is all choices carry consequences, and the choice not to go on, which I have to say I think was the right choice at the time for various reasons, meant that Saddam Hussein stayed in power for the next 12 years, and we'll come on to that in a moment, and an awful lot of people died as a result. And then, of course, the 1990s was dominated by the Balkans, the collapse of Yugoslavia. I did 3 tours in the Balkans, and in the initial deployment after the Dayton Agreement, and then back with the sustainment force, and then a tour with the Kosovo force, KFOR, the first deployment in KFOR, where my brigade built and ran, amongst other things, refugee camps in Albania, in Macedonia, and then subsequently in Kosovo, when we got into Kosovo. So the 1990s were a very busy time, actually. I was away a lot during the 1990s. And then that comes to an end, and of course we move into the decade of the 2000s, the first decade in 2000. The September the 11th happens, and I get involved in the planning for the war in Iraq, end up in CENTCOM in America, Washington, and Florida with the American headquarters, planning the military campaign for moving into Iraq. I was stood up as when we go on an operation like that, we have a a 3-star Lieutenant General, 3-star, Americans would call it 3-star General, who is our Joint Force Commander. In this case, it was an airman called Brian Burridge. We then have 5 component commanders at 2-star level, Major General level, a Navy, Air Force, Army, Special Forces, and Logistic Component Commander. And I was stood up as the Logistic Component Commander. I won't bore you with all the details of that, but that was in 2002. And then in January 2003, I was sent to Washington to join a post-war planning team in Washington, which took me there for a while, then Kuwait, and then into Baghdad. And actually, almost literally to the day, I think, in 2003 is when I came back from Baghdad, having been in Baghdad, as the statue came down and as various things happened and the whole thing went completely pear-shaped. And as a result of that tour, and we'll touch on what we're going to do for the weekend, but failure, strategic level failure, and learning some lessons out of failure. So those were the sort of operational tours, and the highlight really, people often ask me what was my favourite tour, and really it was Squadron Command. Squadron Command in Germany, in a place called Osnabrück, had a squadron of about 100 soldiers, and I knew every one of them by name. I knew their families, I knew their circumstances. A guy called Jonathan Sachs, who some of you may have heard of, a Jewish community leader, a fantastic guy who I got to know quite well. Jonathan defined a community as a place where people know you by name and miss you when you're not there. I think it's a fantastic definition. It's what a church should be. It's what a men's group like this should be. And that squadron was a place, a community of people who I knew. And when I walked around with the Sergeant Major in the morning, you know, you'd notice somebody wasn't there and you'd say, what's happened to Corporal Snodgrass? And he'd say, well, his wife's poorly and what are we doing about it, etc. And the other highlight was commanding a brigade in Kosovo, a brigade of about 4,000, of which we deployed a couple of thousand into Kosovo. The downsides were the reality of being on operations and watching the mass graves being dug up in places like Iraq, watching what people did to each other in Northern Ireland, the kneecappings, the bombs, the shootings and all of that stuff. And that in now I would use these words. It meant that sin, the words sin and evil, are not interesting theological words for me anymore. They are a reality of a brutal, broken world, and what people do to each other, and why do they do it to each other? The internecine warfare, the tribes, the clans, all of these things we see all over the world. So that was had a big impact on me, starting in Northern Ireland and then flowing through the Balkans and Iraq and so forth. But as I said earlier, I loved every day of it. I will be talking about it in tomorrow, which we'll come on to. But the friendship, the bonds of camaraderie, the whole business of being in that military environment was fantastic, really. And I was very lucky. I did some great tours, and I ended up as a Major General. I retired in 2007. I was the Army Advisor to the House of Commons Defence Committee for about 7 years. Established my own business, a limited company, which is 3 pillars, really. One is I'm a director of some companies, so there's a business aspect to that. One based in the Middle East and America, and a couple based here in the UK. I do quite a lot of academic stuff. I'm a visiting professor at some universities, and particularly Nottingham University. And then there's the third bucket, which is I'm a lay minister. I eventually became a lay minister, so I'm heavily involved in the church, but also charity, humanitarian work, and that sort of stuff. And those 3 plates, those 3 pillars overlap, and my strap line is what you referred to earlier. My company strap line is morally courageous leadership. That's what I try to argue, talk about, deliver, challenge people about. Any organisation needs to be led by morally courageous leaders who are very different to managers of businesses and very different in all sorts of other ways, which we'll touch on in the weekend.
Very good, Tom. Thank you. Yeah. So you're in the army for many years, and you're now a lay preacher, and you've got a very strong faith. How did that all come about? From army, war, brutality, all of that. How did you discover your faith?
Yeah, well, and I'm conscious from what Dave told me that not everybody here is a churchgoer or a Christian, would call themselves necessarily a Christian. I was raised in what everybody would have called about in those days. We would have called ourselves a Christian family. My mum and dad would have called themselves Christians, but they were not churchgoers. I went to a Church of England primary school, and I was sent to church occasionally. But church wasn't big in our family at all in any sense, and Jesus meant nothing to anybody. When I went to Sandhurst, for whatever reason, and I don't quite know why, I wanted to get confirmed. So I was confirmed at Sandhurst, which was quite unusual. I was married in 1972 to Christine, my wife. We met while I was at Sandhurst, just had our golden wedding anniversary last year. So we were married in church, traditional thing to do. Children were baptised in the church. Again, really traditional thing to do. And I would have called myself a Christian, but to be honest, it was pretty meaningless. It didn't mean very much, and it didn't in any way impact on my day-to-day life. I then did a tour in Cyprus, which I didn't mention earlier, which was in 1981, working with the United Nations. Cyprus was a divided country. Turks had invaded in 1974. I worked with the UN and the Green Line, the sort of line down the middle of Cyprus. And over the Easter period, I got an opportunity of just getting a seat on a UN aeroplane, a couple of seats, and having a break. And we left the children with some friends. Christine and I got on this UN aeroplane and flew to Jerusalem. The UN had a lot of operations in the Middle East in those years, peacekeeping operations in the Golan Heights, in the Sinai Desert, in various other places, and in Jerusalem. So we managed to get these seats. We went just as tourists. We stayed in a hotel, and we inevitably went to some of the biblical sites. We went to Bethlehem, we wandered around Jerusalem and so on. And we went to the Anglican Cathedral in Jerusalem on Easter Sunday, which happened, it was over the Easter weekend, as I say, we were there. And over a cup of coffee, somebody said to me, "Have you been to the Garden Tomb?" Well, I'd never heard of the Garden Tomb. I don't know whether anybody has heard of the Garden Tomb, but it's a place outside the old city wall in Jerusalem. And actually, we walked past it on the previous Friday, I think on the Good Friday. It's got a couple of things I'll come back to in a moment. So they told us where to go, and Christine and I went to the Garden Tomb. I was a captain in the army at the time. The guide in the Garden Tomb that day was a retired British Army colonel, gunner, an artilleryman. And it was very different. I mean, I'm talking 1981 here, very different to what it is today, much less touristy, very quiet and peaceful. And he took us around, showed us around, and he explained to us that this place was outside the old city wall. It had a first century wine press. It had a skull-shaped formation, which looked like a skull, eyes and so forth. And it had a first century tomb. And he read through a little bit of John's Gospel, which talks about the place where Christ was crucified and then buried. And he said, "I think this is the place." The traditional place is a big cathedral inside Jerusalem called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is, without putting too fine a point on it, a dump full of tourists and very unspiritual. But this place was very quiet and very peaceful. So he talked us all through this. It was my 30th birthday that day. And at the end of all of this, he said, "Look, this may or may not be the place. But the most important thing is, if you go and look in the tomb is empty." And feeling a bit of a prat, I stood up and walked over to this tomb. I don't know what I expected to find in 1981 inside this tomb, but I leant on the entrance to it and I looked inside, and I suddenly found myself thinking, there can't be more important question than was this tomb empty on that first Easter Sunday or not? And if it wasn't empty, then hundreds of millions of people have been wasting their time for the last 2,000 years, because the whole thing's nonsense. And Paul says in one of his letters to the church in Corinth, if Christ did not rise from the dead, then we of all men are to be pitied, because it is a complete waste of time. But if Christ rose from the dead on that first Easter Sunday, Monday, then that's a pretty important issue. And it wasn't, for me, a Damascus Road experience, for those of you who know the story of Paul on the road to Damascus, but it had a big impact on me. And I went back to Cyprus, and I found myself thinking, I need to take this seriously. I need to decide, having been a nominal Christian with all that I've talked about before, was this going to be important to me or not? And I chatted with some good friends. I have a fellow captain a guy called Mark Chester, who I still see, was a Christian, and he talked me through it. And I read through the Bible and the scriptures, the Gospels and so on. And I just got to the point where I thought to myself, come on, you've got to make a decision. Get off the fence, either decide to go for this or not. And I made a decision to become a disciple of Christ. And that was later on, probably around June time in 1981. And it transformed my life in all sorts of ways, which we'll touch on during the weekend.
So thank you. So tell us a bit more about the weekend. What sort of lies ahead for us?
Well, I think, when we talked about this theme of making a difference and what does that look like for us, one of the things that I've sort of thought about a lot over the years is how do you generate what the British Army call fighting power? When you watch a military go off to war, what do you think about in your own mind about whether they're going to win or not? So as we watch the task force sail off in 1982, what was this? How did you decide whether we were going to win this campaign or not? How do we decide whether Russia is going to win or Ukraine is going to win, or however we define winning? So fighting power is quite an important issue, and I just want to touch on tomorrow morning how we generate fighting power in the British Army. And the key issue of fighting power is called the moral component of fighting power. It's about things like leadership and friendship, which you touched on quite rightly in the context of the weekend, but I also mentioned in the context of being in the military. Words like friendship and fidelity and honour and duty and integrity and so on. And then to say, okay, if that's the military component about fighting power, what does that look like in a society? What does that mean for businesses and for the nation as a whole? And look at that, and I'm going to use an illustration, a Jonathan Sachs illustration actually, which I think is really helpful. And then just ask, look at what's the nature of our society today? What does that mean for us today? What does it look like? So that's what I want to touch on tomorrow morning. And then I want to pick up the theme of failure tomorrow evening. I want to talk about how do we deal with failure? The reality that we all fail. I've been through this business in Baghdad and I've reflected on it quite a lot. I came back from Baghdad absolutely knackered. I mean, I was drained emotionally, physically, and professionally, to be honest, in all sorts of ways, but also spiritually. It was, a very draining experience. And I had to sort of face the reality that I had been part of that strategic failure. I briefed the Prime Minister, I briefed Jack Straw, I'd had lunch with Rumsfeld, I appeared as a witness in front of the Chilcot inquiry. So I had to ask myself some pretty serious questions, what was my part in this and how do you deal with it? And I think there are probably a lot more actually, but I think there are 4 ways we can respond to failure. I want to touch on those. And I want to ask the question about how we individually deal with failure. And part of that is having the courage to face up to the reality that we get things wrong, we cock it up, and we make choices. Those choices have consequences, and we have to live with them. In our personal lives, in our marriages, in the way we bring up our children, in our businesses. And then I want to take that forward on Sunday morning and talk about courage. What does courage look like? What's the distinction between physical courage and moral courage? And try and challenge us all, including myself, on how we stand up to be courageous people. And to be honest, to try and end up with, picking up your point, that when we leave here, that we will have been challenged, hopefully encouraged, to get out there in the world and be morally courageous leaders. To go out there and make a difference in our homes, in our businesses, and in our nation. Because by God, we need morally courageous leaders in politics and economics, in our NHS, in our schools, and all the rest of it. So I want to try and end up on a theme of courage and what that looks like and send us out trying to make a difference.
Fantastic.
If that helps.
Looking forward to it. And, Tim, it's a great pleasure to have you. Thank you. Thank you for.
I will start off tomorrow by hoping to manage your expectations.
So, chefs, Craig, when do you want us? Is it